So let's get started. I invite Lakshmi to present her paper, Lessons Learned from Singapore Towards an Efficient Public Transport Policy, a case demonstration for the city of Pondicherry.
Good afternoon all. This is Lakshmi Tilagam Natarajan from India. I'm an architect and urban designer, and the presentation I'm making today is based on a family trip that we made to Singapore last year. This trip had a profound effect on me with regards to the urban environment and the public transportation. So the framework of my presentation will be in two parts. In the first part, I shall talk about what I saw in Singapore. And in the second part, I'm trying to see how I can apply it in my own hometown of Pondicherry. So Singapore, as we all know, is a democratic city-state with a very limited land resource, but a very high urban density. And when we look at some of the economic indicators in comparison to other countries in its league, Singapore ensures a very high quality of life for its residents. And that's evident through its GDP and GNI. And one of the sector that contributes to this GDP growth is the tourism sector. And as you can see here, while the resident population, the stable resident population is only about 5.7 million in 2019, the international tourist arrival was 19.1 million, which is almost 4 times its resident population. And the major contributors to this number are its Asian neighbors like China, Indonesia, India, and Malaysia. And it's very interesting to note that most of these countries have a very low foreign exchange when compared to the Singapore currency. For example, a Singapore dollar equals to 50 rupees in Indian currency. So when we move on to the public transport, Singapore has a very popular public transport comprising of the bus network and the very large rail network consisting of the MRT and LRT. And as you can see in this graph, the daily ridership, the average daily ridership in 2006 for MRT was just about 1.4 million. And within a decade, it more than doubled. It was 3+ million by 2016. So the public transport is immensely popular with the residents. And when we compare this statistics with some of the other global cities, it's interesting to note that Singapore has only about 10 cars for every 100 persons, when we see that London has more than 30 cars per 100 person. And similarly, Singapore has a huge number of bus fleets per million persons. And this is very evident through the statistics of the motor vehicular population. When you see that when most of the Asian countries are struggling with the fast growing vehicle motor numbers on their roads, Singapore is showing a decreasing trend. The numbers of vehicles in 2014 is lesser than what it was in 2013. Now, this is also supported by its urban design policies. For example, when we look at the transport mode used by students, less than 50% of the primary school students need to travel at all. They don't travel, they just walk to school. And only about 40% of the secondary school students need to take a bus to go, travel within their sector. It is mostly the employed people and the higher education students, university students, who use the public transportation. So Singapore's public transportation is highly popular with its residents. And Singapore currently has about 5 MRT lines. And these lines are also, running with full capacity. As you can see in this map, this world map, which shows some of the large metropolitan cities and the frequency of the rail network usage. We see that Singapore is in a very high frequency usage with 30 trains per hour or more. And the Land Transport Authority of Singapore, which takes care of all its land transport, is not, complacent with this. They aim to increase their public transport peak hour mode by 75% in 2030, by 2030. So they are investing on more new lines, and they're also looking at about how to increase the frequency in the existing lines. Well, this is about the local residents. So how about the international tourists? Does the public transport work the same way for the international tourists? The public transports agency's motto is efficient, connected, and convenience. So how efficient? Now, when we look at the international tourists, the moment they land at the Changi International Airport, even before you go to the immigration desk, there are lots of maps that are, on stands for you to pick up and plan your trips. And Singapore's LTA's mobile apps are one of the famous all over the world for planning your trips. And in terms of convenience, Singapore has a single prepaid ticket which can be used both for all kinds of public transport. And there are various kinds of discounts and incentives that they give if you keep using it more and more. And these tickets are all easily collectible at the MRT stations or on vending machines in popular public places. And in terms of connectivity, one of the best aspects that I liked was the multimodal interchange hubs, transport hubs that Singapore has designed so beautifully. For example, what you're seeing are the photos of the Nicole Highway interchange hub, where if you take the escalator on the left, you will go to the MRT station. And if you take the corridor on the right, you will go to the bus stop. And you can actually see the bus stop when you're crossing the footover bridge. And just to show you the kind of experience that we had on a 45-minute ride where we traveled from Beach Road to Dover. We seamlessly took an MRT, crossed over a footover bridge, took a bus, and this is us waiting at the bus stop. And in each bus stop, the information boards are beautifully designed to give you all the information regarding the bus routes, the road index, the fare summary, the timings. So it's very easy. You don't need to rely on a resident, or you don't need to look out for people for information. And then once again, a door-to-door experience. So for the international tourists, the public transport is highly safe, and it is also accessible, very accessible. But the plus point is the design of these MRT stations. The MRT stations have been designed as integrated transportation hubs, which means that they are not just transportation stations, they are connected with commercial malls. So tourists can spend their time shopping or dining before they pick up a train. So the transportation hub is an experience on its own. And the best part is the last mile connectivity, which is ensured by these long covered pedestrian pathways which connect the housing sectors to the major bus stops. So in Singapore, some of the lessons that I found very interesting are the way they have embraced sustainable development at all levels, and to see to it that it benefits all categories. It's not just about residents, or it's not just about tourists, it's for both. And they try to do this by enhancing the last mile connectivity. So by just doing some of these initiatives of 1 to 7 and integrating it along with their urban master plan, I saw the urban environment work in a fantastic manner to ensure not just social, but economic and environmental sustainability. So when I got back to my own hometown of Pondicherry, Pondicherry is a small coastal town located on the southern part of India.
Lakshmi, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you only have 1 minute left.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's conclude. Thank you.
Okay. So what's interesting about Pondicherry is that it was a colonial town, and because of its French connection, Pondicherry has a very high footfall of tourists. So while the population of Pondicherry is only 1.2 lakhs, we see that the footfall is very much high. And what is unique is that brings the tourists is the kind of tourism that is promoted by the architecture and the urban environment. So this is the main core to which the tourists flock. And in all of this, what the pitiable state is that the transport, the public transport, does not help the tourists or the local residents. And this is where the problem comes in. But Pondicherry was not so always. For example, if we look at in the 1970s, it was called as a cycle city of India. And if we see the statistics in 2019, we see that the number of two-wheelers has increased by 126 times. So when we
I'm sorry, can you go to your concluding slide, the last slide, because I really have to. And
I just have two slides.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So if we just look at the public transport of Pondicherry with comparison to Singapore, we see that the public transport is very limited and the citizens are need to rely on private transport modes. So which is where the problem comes. And therefore, so this was my conclusion of where I was thinking about integrating the peripheral network to the city core through public transport, and also to bring back the earlier cycling status of Pondicherry. So to enhance the cycling tracks and also to increase the walkability index by bettering the pedestrian pathways. So yeah, so that was my presentation on Singapore and Pondicherry. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I'm sorry, but we have limited time, so we actually don't have time for questions right now. We'll have to come back to your presentation a bit later in the Q&A. So I now give the floor to Gonzalo Salazar. Gonzalo, I hope your connection is stable and you have 10 minutes.
So hello to everyone. I hope that you are well in this complex worldwide pandemic. My name is Gonzalo Salazar, Associate Professor of the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile and researcher from the Center of Sustainable Urban Development, CEDEUS, and the Center for Intercultural and Indigenous Studies both in Chile. The title of my presentation today is Mobility and Intercultural Diversity in Intermediate Urban System of Latin America, an approach from the new mobility paradigm. I have led a research line on intermediate cities and intercultural mobility in southern Chile since 2012. Several colleagues and researchers, assistants, and postgraduate students have greatly, of course, contributed to this project, generating an ongoing interdisciplinary teams that combine several disciplines. The research project combines two theoretical frameworks. The first one is about planning and development of intermediate, or if you like, medium-sized cities in Latin America. This is an image of the intermediate city of Villarrica in southern Chile, one of our case studies. The second theoretical framework is about intercultural and indigenous mobility processes related to this kind of cities, as it happens in the city of Villarrica and many in Latin American systems or intermediate cities here with the presence of Mapuche indigenous groups and its colonial history. So regarding the first theoretical framework, we started in 2012, recognizing that the focus on large metropolitan areas in order to understand urban phenomena is not necessarily the most appropriate approach. Although the percentage of population living in big metropolitan cities has consistently increased since the onset of Industrial Revolution, 50% of urban global population inhabits urban areas within fewer than 500,000 people. And this is also the case in Latin America. So, however, most of research of these cities has the problem of reducing to demographic criteria, overlooking the fact that they are characterized by intense socio-spatial interaction with the surrounding rural areas and other nearby urban centers. So for us, it's been key that this is a serious shortcoming in terms of potential use of research for urban planning and the resulting development and processes of these cities and the mobility practices in these cities. So in order to transcend this static and demographic approach about medium-sized cities, we have embraced the intermediate cities approach that seeks to deal with socio-spatial processes through the concept of intermediation. So intermediate cities are characterized by intense interaction with the surrounding rural areas, other nearby urban areas, and the outside world, rather than the size of the city and population size range. So a key research aspect for us here has been to analyze the role of mobility dynamics in this scalar process of intermediation. A key aspect of many intermediate cities in Latin America is their indigenous and intercultural configuration. The urbanization process of indigenous groups in Latin America has been really intense in the last 30 years. Today, for example, 65% of indigenous people in Chile live in cities. So exploring indigenous migration and mobile processes has become a key aspect to understand complexity of this phenomenon. Yet, drawing our approach from the decolonial literature, we have realized that one, most of the research on urbanization of indigenous populations in Latin America is mainly concentrated in metropolitan cities, and two, a very static and dualistic approach has been the focus. So there is a tendency to make a static definition of, for example, urban indigenous or rural indigenous, thereby neglecting that they might be connected in some way or another. So in order to understand the intermediation dynamic of these intercultural cities, we think that it is fundamental to attend the mobility processes, particularly those related to the hinterlands in these cities. So both conceptually and methodologically, we have proposed the new mobility paradigm, originally, as you know, proposed by Schiller, Ari, and Creswell. We think that it's a key to explore the complexity of intermediation in intercultural contexts. So from this paradigm, mobility is no longer understood as simply moving from one point to another. Instead, the focus is on movement itself, no? So we are not only interested in the physical mobility that connects the city with its rural hinterland, in which most indigenous people actually live, but the whole phenomenological and political aspect behind the process of mobility. So this implies the need to deal with the connection between people and places with which mobility acquires symbolic, material, and political expressions. So our thesis here has been, for this work, has been that mobility process implies dynamic and heterogeneous construction of territories that is diverse from of being indigenous in the city through mobility. And second one is that politically the diverse form of mobile placemaking have been made invisible by public policies and transport planning that foster dualistic, static, and sometimes hegemonic representation and configuration of the urban space. So in order to explore this, we have developed a methodological proposal for intercultural socio-spatial practices through mixed mobile methods on a regional scale and also in the hinterland scale. On a regional scale, we have done typical regional inter-urban commuting mapping, but the most interesting thing has been in the hinterland level. We have actually taken the bus and done several inter-urban flux mapping, traveling interviews in the bus, and many participatory mapping. So we have analyzed inter-urban hotspots, routes, rhythms, experience, several kind of motivations. We have done also other hinterland methodologies, but we are not. I won't have time to show that. This is the region of La Araucanía in southern Chile. So we have done our study in the city of Temuco and all the hinterlands to the coast of the Pacific Ocean. And we have also worked with the city of Villarrica in southern part of the region and its relationship with the hinterland and indigenous community in the foothills of the Andes Mountains. So we, at the regional level, we have had done some commuting analysis, and we have seen that it shows that great importance of these intermediate cities of like Angol, Temuco, and Villarrica in the region. No, they configure strong nodes of daily intercommunal and interurban commuting, becoming the epicenter of social, economic, and cultural activities. They connect in a way the small town with the major urban systems and even global interconnections. Yet the problem with this typical sort of commuting analysis for us is that they say nothing about the experience of mobility itself. And also they don't show the intermediation and interdependency of the intermediate cities with the immediate rural hinterland. For example, the city of Temuco is surrounded by hundreds of indigenous communities. Each of these yellow points is actually a Mapuche community that may have intense interconnection with this urban area. So exploring the relationship of these communities with the urban area of Temuco has been a key element to understand dynamic urbanization process of originally rural communities, and also the urban-rural interdependency that characterize intermediate cities in the world. So that's why we actually took the bus and we have identified, as this figure, identify all points at which passengers get on and off the bus along the inter-urban routes on different schedules. These multiple points can be understood as real mobility hotspots then. So each mobility hotspot constitutes a particular place, providing information on microgeographies derived from relationship between mobility and place. So in this case,
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but you have 1 minute left.
Okay, so each hotspot, each spot dynamically connects several indigenous communities with the main road to the city of Temuco. So more importantly for us is that each of these hotspots on the map is related to a network of routes to the territory which are part of the mobility experience in these areas. So we have analyzed how this is connected to, how these cities are connected to this hinterland level.
Please conclude, yes, Gonzalo, sorry.
Yes, I'm concluding in 30 seconds. And how these also have become really political. No, all the indigenous people use these transport platforms or mobility platforms also to do some vindication processes. So these hotspots today are really important for the indigenous urbanization processes. So just to conclude is that every movement implies a subject experience and representation that physically and symbolically constitute heterogeneous territories. Sociospatial mobility configures microgeographies full of intercultural significance, practices, and activities that need to be deeply explored. The mobility approach encourages problematizing the intermediation dynamics in political terms, and also need to move forward in the scholar study methods by means of mobility processes, for example. So they need to describe and explain the complexity of sociospatial practices from a relational paradigm of a space is very important for us.
Great, thank you so much, Gonzalo. You're out of breath there at the end. Yes. I'm very sorry, but we only have 10 minutes for talk, and you've gone on a few minutes extra. So I do have to pass the baton now to Juan Antonio. Perhaps just to say, we heard while Juan Antonio is getting ready, both presentations were very different this afternoon. One was more focused on lessons learned, another one perhaps more of an embodied experience to space and mobility, but both very interesting in terms of questioning the scale in which mobility plays out. So now we will turn over to Juan Antonio. So the floor is yours, Juan Antonio.
Thank you very much, Marlene. I'm Juan Antonio Carrasco. I'm also from Chile. So this is a half Chilean session. I work in Universidad de Concepción on the Center of Human Development as well. And this is an ongoing work with colleagues from Universidad de Concepción, from sociology, nutritional studies, and also from a colleague from University Catholic of Chile, who's geographer. The main objective of this work, I'm a civil engineer, but this is really, we're trying to focus in an interdisciplinary way on the question of accessibility to healthy food. Specifically trying to assess the role of open street markets. Not only in Chile, but also I think this is a phenomenon all over Latin America as well. The key thing here is to really understand what's the role of open street markets in the access to healthy food, but not only the physical access, but what is the role that it plays in terms of nutrition, but also how that relates. Now, it actually questions after COVID-19. Just a special the territorial context. This is Concepcion, a little bit north from what Gonzalo just presented, but this is a more metropolitan city with 1 million people. You can see in the colors, the blue colors are those areas with higher income groups, and whereas the red ones are in the outskirts are those income groups. And the key thing was trying to understand basically the role of supermarkets in relation to open street markets, which are they are very interestingly located mostly on neighborhoods. They have a lot of tax exceptions, which makes them very attractive for low-income groups, but also in terms of the quality of what they offer, and also the role of local stores. Although I will talk so much about that. We work with what is called a Nutrition Environment Measures Survey, which is basically an instrument that was adapted to the Chilean context, trying to understand the key role of the characteristics of what kind of food is sold on the one hand, but also the quality of them. We work in basically exposure to stores, and also looked at some intercept questionnaires to look at behavior. Key elements that I want to raise in this short time that we have. First of all, if we look at the access to open street markets, this is basically like the amounts of meters that someone has close one of these stores, and this is a kind of income, basically low, medium, and high, and we find immediately somehow an opposite relationship between income and open street markets and supermarkets. Supermarkets tend to be serving a lot of the high income groups, whereas open street markets tend to be very important for accessibility to low income groups. So, and we have seen this in the past, even in North America, what is called the redlining effect, that basically supermarkets tend to focus on high income areas. But not only that, open street markets tend to be very important for low income groups. One of the dimensions are nutritional aspects. This is basically a comparison between what is in Spanish is bodega. I'm sorry, this is in Spanish, but it's in Spanish, but this is mostly supermarkets are basically sell cheap basic elements, but not fresh food or vegetables. Then you have the open street markets and the supermarkets for 4 groups, which are basically increasingly complex in terms of the processing stage. So group 1 is basically the most important one for us, which is basically related to fruit and vegetables. And when you compare supermarkets and open street markets, this is basically the point system that the instrument gives in terms of the quality from a nutritional viewpoint. And there are not so many differences compared with what you can have in other groups. Which means, and this is a small, basically, synthesis of that, especially in the case of group 1, is that open street markets provide not only the access, but also the quality in terms of the food nutritional stage for several of the income groups, especially the low income groups. For the other groups, there are some differences, especially for processed and ultra-processed ingredients, which are less healthy, and where supermarkets basically provide more of this kind of food. So basically, for what is more important, which is group 1, open street markets provide a very, very important role on that. That is basically one key idea that I would like to highlight here. A second key idea in terms of nutritional dimensions is related to basically what means for transportation. These are very different kinds of stores and what it means in terms of walking. compared to cars. This is basically performed with our survey, and what you can see is basically how, well, mini markets, of course, are very important in walking distance, and how, to which extent, open street markets are very important as well in terms of walking. And there are not so many differences with supermarkets, which means that the mode of transportation here does not have a key difference, but in terms of frequency, open street markets tend to be very important, especially in terms of the accessibility and in terms of the frequency for low-income groups, which means that they also provide the opportunity of walking or having slow mode mobility towards them, which is very, very different from what you can see in the case of supermarkets, where high-income groups tend to go more frequent to there, on the one hand, but also they tend to be mostly by car rather than walking. Also, in terms of the reasons to choose the stores, we asked that because it was important for us not only to understand the nutritional side, the spatial side, but also the attitudinal sides of people on going to one place with respect to others. Affordability is very important. Home proximity is also an important reason why people tend to go to supermarkets. And actually, interestingly enough, open street markets, we tend to be local. Not necessarily that's a key reason to go there. So even it's not only the local, but also some people willing to travel a little bit longer to go to these places. And finally, just a third key element here is in terms of the locations. You can see in red, yellow, and green the relationship between locations and prices. And then you can see a lot of green dots for open street markets, non-green dots for supermarkets. These are basically chart styles of prices. So what we basically are providing evidence here is that open street markets are really the cheapest places in the greater metropolitan area, very much spread all over the all over the metropolitan area, whereas supermarkets tend to be very much focused on high and medium income groups, although low income groups sometimes have to go there because of other reasons, such as, for example, they can provide credit for purchasing food. A couple of other key elements from the geographic viewpoint. If you look at average distances, for example, the darker is longer distances with respect to people. And then you can see again, supermarkets tend to be much more specifically driven towards people who live much far away from their homes. And in terms of, and actually you could see the same in the case of workplaces as well. And finally, this is a kind of complex figure, but just to summarize in 20 seconds, what we are looking at here is really how clustered spatially these stores are. Supermarkets tend to be much closer to downtown, which is very somewhat a high-income area in the case of Concepcion, and open street markets tend to be more spread. And a 30-second conclusions. Basically, we know for a long time that open street markets in Chile are very important, but we haven't had the key evidence on linking nutritional dimensions, spatial dimension, and price and purchasing dimensions, and in terms of also the attitudes of people doing that. And we think that linking those 4 dimensions is very important to really understand their role on nutrition and the health of people in that city. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Juan Antonio. So a very nice presentation on how access to healthy food links to mobility and accessibility, and really bringing in the different dimensions of sustainability. A very nice presentation. I don't know if we have time for one question, but looking at the clock, since we have to end at 30 minutes past, I think I'll pass on to Naoki Takayama to make sure that, Naoki, you have enough time, so 10 minutes. And then at the end, I'll maybe ask one round of questions to everyone. And if the audience would like to submit their questions, there is a Q&A here where you can do that, and the different authors can get back to you on the questions you might have. So Naoki, the floor is yours.
Okay. Hello everyone, my name is Naoki Takayama from Nagoya University in Japan. My research is analysis on the intention of teleworking, considering risk perception and commuting and ICT use. Okay, traffic congestion is must be solved in order to aim for sustainable society. As a solution, structured work and promotion of public transportation have been promoted. Telework is one of them, but it haven't made much progress in Japan. With the COVID-19 pandemic, people have moved to telework. In the situation of semi-forced transition to telework, it is important to understand the current situation of telework in COVID-19 and the intention to use telework in future for sustainable society. As a previous study, the use of cars and motorcycle increased during the pandemic. There are also papers that point out increasing in the telework rate during a pandemic and differences in teleworking by industry. Our study investigates that how personal socio-economic attributes and the risk perception of commuting and telework affect the telework intention, with the expectation that commuting risk increase telework intention and telework risk decrease telework intention. Here is data description. We conducted a questionnaire survey on the web. The survey period is from 2020, March 24th to March 30th, just before declaration of a state of emergency from Japanese government. Target person are workers aged 20 to 60 years old. Areas are Tokyo Metropolitan Area, Osaka Metropolitan Area, and Aichi Metropolitan Areas. They are Japan's 3 major metropolitan areas, and the number of data is 3,500. Next is descriptive statistics by area. And occupation ratio is not so different between 3 metropolitan areas. In commuting mode, trains account for the highest proportion in Tokyo metropolitan area, and the proportion of cars increases as moving to Osaka and Aichi metropolitan areas. Next is telework rate, and 70% of people at any age do not do telework at all. The proportion of other telework rate are also the same for different age groups. In this survey, 908 people were telework users. Next is the reason of telework by area. Every region is similar, and top 2 reasons are blue one and infectious disease, and green, free time available. Next is telework intention. Looking at the age group graph in the upper left, we can see that young people in their 20s and 30s have a higher telework intention. The upper right is a graph commuting mode. You can see that train users have a high telework intention. In the graph by commuting time, you can see that the telework intention increases as the commuting time increases. And telework intention and possibility of commuting risks. Commuting risk has 3 items. 1, traffic jam and delays. 2, traffic accident. 3, infection. It is a graph about the possibility of each of 3 items and telework intention. If they overestimate the risk of any item, the telework intention tends to be high. The following graph shows telework intention and influence of commuting risks of the 3 items. Also this slide, if they overestimate the risk of any item, the telework intention tends to be high. Next is telework intention and possibility of the risk in telework. Telework risk has 5 items. 1. Virus and intrusion. 2. Leakage of important information. 3. Being lost or stolen devices. 4. Device breakdown. 5. Occurring network communication troubles. It is a graph of each possibility and telework intention. If they overestimate the risk, the telework intention tends to be high. The result was different from my prediction, that is, telework risk decreases telework intention. The following graph shows influence of the telework risk of previous 5 items. If they overestimate influence of the risk, the telework intention tends to be high. The result was also different from my prediction. Telework risk decreases telework intention. 5 is methodology. We use ordered probit model. I said, question, do you want to reduce or increase telework? As U is utility function of telework intention. This is result of ordered probit model. The number of sample is 908. And first of all, as people who want to increase telework is young people and public transportation user, walking and bicycle users who commute longer, and people teleworking more than half of the month. They want to increase telework. In risk factors, the influence of infection and possibility of network troubles and the influence of being lost or stolen devices, those who overestimate the risks wanted to increase telework. And those who overestimated possibility of leakage of important information wanted to reduce telework. This is conclusion. And increased telework intention people is young people and high telework rate person and public transportation user and walking and bicycle user who commute longer. And commuting risk affect telework intention. That is, people who highly perceive the risk of the influence of infection wants to increase telework. Some telework risk affect telework intention. That is, people who highly perceive the risk of the possibility of network troubles and the influence of being lost or stolen devices and want to increase telework. It's not what I expected, but it's a reasonable result from the data description. Maybe there is a possibility people are aware of the risks of telework, but they want to telework. Last is future work and improving the analysis result of the ordered probit model. And it's make a model that can consider the correlation between risks. Next is including the evaluation of telework efficiency as an explanatory variable. We had 18 questions about evaluation of telework efficiency. So put that in the explanatory variable. Thank you for listening. That's all.
Great, thank you so much, Naoki. Very interesting presentation on telework. So maybe we can start a discussion with all four people who presented their, four people who presented their papers. In all of your papers, maybe I can kick it off, we notice the need for mobility to account for diversity in terms of what people are using transportation, in what way, for what reasons, etc. So maybe could you comment a little bit on how future policies around more sustainable mobility could integrate this diversity of users? What are your opinions on this, or how would a policy process go about accounting for this kind of complexity in terms of distinguishing the young from the old, those who are more risk averse from others, etc.? Would anyone like to comment on that question?
We may start maybe thinking about our study on healthy food. I mean, I would put the question maybe in another way of just thinking that we cannot avoid that kind of complexity anymore. We tend to be very much, and it's not only in terms of classifying different kinds of users in the more traditional sense of mobility, but actually different segments of people. It's also in the because some is really questioning ourselves to which extent we are hiding certain segments of people in our analysis, and we have been very much focused on the typical commuting to trip to work. And even in the case of tourism, it's very interesting how the link of the first presentation of Lakshmi made in the sense of really saying, well, this is tourism, but we don't want to, but it's important not to hide the other users that are on the road, the women, the low income groups, and other people. So to which extent it's also, I think it's a dual thing. Is on the one hand recognizing the complexity of different segments, but on the other hand, I think it's really trying to be very careful on not hiding different segments of people that we tend to find that traditionally have been hidden in mobility analysis, similar to what Gonzalo has seen also with indigenous people as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's very important, not to render certain people invisible in this process. Gonzalo, did you want to comment on that?
No, I lost my connection, so I didn't hear anything, sorry.
That's okay. So Lakshmi, would you like to comment on that? How to account for different people and not to exclude people? I guess we could also reflect on whether the policy itself should be inclusive, or even how to include diverse people in a procedural approach to designing policies for their city. What would that look like? Some kind of a participatory engagement of citizens. Lakshmi, your example of Singapore is very top down, actually. Singapore is really known for having established sort of an authoritative approach to mobility, and actually price has an important price is an important factor. It costs some, $20,000 US just to have a license plate in Singapore. So it's very much an exclusive approach, or excluding approach to mobility. What would you say about that, Lakshmi?
Yeah. So when I actually started writing this paper as an urban designer in the Asian countries, we keep facing this issue of mobility, and especially for the middle income category of people. And countries like India are highly dependent on private vehicle ownership. So at some point of time, this policy making needs to change. And it's not just about mobility, it's not just about transportation. It's to do with the entire urban fabric. So it needs to have an integrated approach if we are going to, in any ways, achieve a sustainable goal. But however, while writing the paper and in the current COVID situation, the whole question of public transportation, is widely challenged. And how we are going to move on with this in pandemic situations is another challenge.
Great, yeah. So I wanted to give the floor to, Gonzalo wants to comment on this too. You raised the hand, Gonzalo, go ahead.
Yes, I just want to comment that I think that in order to foster sustainability and inclusive, sustainable and inclusive mobility a methodological approach is very important in science. How we change from something that has been very top down towards something that in a way fosters the experiential and political aspects of mobility, you know, how people actually move, how people create places through movement, and how these places are actually integrated in public policies is a very important contribution that we can make from science and the academy in general. How we interconnect sciences and disciplines is also very important here. Mm-hmm.
So there's a question that comes in for everyone in the Q&A there, and it is, what do you think about the role of service providers to reduce risk in teleworking? I guess this is a question for Naoki. What do you think about the importance of service providers? This is a question from your audience.
Yes, I think it's service provider is mobility or telework service provider. I don't know.
I'm not sure actually, but maybe,
yes,
I guess
yes.
answer as you like.
Yes, if a telework service provider and that improve the security of teleworking and some gathering some case study of teleworking incident, or so telework service provider effort gather some information for teleworking, I think.
Thank you. Great. I don't know, Elena, do you want us, should we take another few minutes and go over time, or should we break now? I guess it's up to the presenters. Do you have any questions for each other after seeing your presentations? I thought they were all...
Marlene, yeah? I think there's some, another question that I thought it was very interesting from the audience related to basically the formal and informal providers, which at least that was related with open street markets. And I think it's very important, and just to mention something that we have found here, open street markets in Chile tend to be very formal, but then there are other small open street markets that are very close to supermarkets that actually tend to complement and being cheap. I think we have to recognize informality as an important part of the urban environment. Both in mobility, informal mobility plays an important role in the global south, but also in terms of the provision of basic services, and in this case of food. And we have to try to hidden below the carpet informality in the scholarly research. And I think this is a time that we have to bring it up, because it plays an important role. And the key thing is how to live with this informality in order to be fair for everybody, but also recognizing the role that it plays.
Yes.
That it has. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a very good point. And then also how to include people that may be associated with informality in the process of designing, designing for change. Great. So we've gone a little bit into the break. I don't know if, does everyone want to make a sort of final concluding remark and then we can end? Gonzalo, do you want to start?
Just want to say that I think that it's really important in the southern globe, in the southern part of the world, to put attention to other urban systems in order to understand sustainable mobility. Here I am, for example, in a very small town in the middle of foothills, in the foothills of Andes, and there is not much information about how people move and construct places through their mobility. More than Latin America is a very urbanized continent, but most of the research is still in metropolitan systems. And it's very important to pay attention to these smaller towns in order to understand the whole complexity of what actually mobility means in this part of the world.
Great. Naoki, would you like to make a concluding remark?
So thank you for this presentation. It's my first time for like this communication, so it's so poor English, is sorry, but I learned more about mobility, and as a researcher's PowerPoint presentation. So today is so good time. Thank you.
Oh, good, Naoki. Well, you did a great job for your first conference talk. You did very well, and your results are very interesting around young people, particularly. Thank you for coming. And Lakshmi, would you like to say a concluding remark?
Yeah. If ever the UN dream of achieving sustainable development goals by 2030 is to be realized, I think one of the first things that Asian countries, especially India, needs to do is a very detailed data documentation, because sustainability cannot be based on whimsical fancies. It needs to be based on ground realities. And for that, countries like India lack the kind of data, the information, and only if we are able to gather the real information, on-ground information, will we be able to arrive at policies which can achieve these kind of goals. So I think it's time we started there with the first step of getting the exact data on board. So yeah, so that's my concluding remark. Thank you.
Thank you. And what about you, Juan Antonio, a concluding remark?
Well, first of all, thanks for the opportunity of presenting here. And again, I think that's, in my opinion, it's very important to really start having more conversations, not only between disciplines, but between different realities of the globe, because I think it's this kind of discussions in terms of mobility and even sustainability goals have been mostly European and North American centric, and we have to really push towards other places of the world, even thinking about Japan and Asia, but also the other places of the global south. And I think this is actually an agenda where we have to push from different sides of the disciplines. Me as an engineer, for example, but also in terms of the questions that are more complex in the way or the dimensions that we have discussed from our different viewpoints.
Indeed, great. Thank you so much. So thank you all for being in this session. We'll now take a break and we'll convene again at 4 o'clock for the second part of Aspirations and Acceptance, including 4, 5, 6, 7 papers in that session. So I hope to see you there. Thanks to everyone. Round of applause to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. We'll be back.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.